Good morning to everybody joining us from Europe, and good day to everybody joining us from elsewhere. Thank you very much for sparing time to be with us and hopefully in an inspiring part of the day. We hope to have your contributions and so that you will be inspired to the debate on de-risking and economic security. Surely there's no better way these days to start the day with if you're working in the Ministry of Economic Affairs or Foreign Affairs these days, but also in businesses, because economic security and de-risking is, I think, on the minds of political leaders and CEOs everywhere. My name is Maaike Okeno-Heijmans. I am Program Lead for Geopolitics of Technology and Digitalization at the Clingendael Institute, and I will be your moderator for today. And I have the honor to introduce to you our stellar lineup of panelists. Perhaps they just want to show their hands as I introduce them. Mikael Wigel of the Finnish Institute for International Affairs in Helsinki, Research Director there, of course. Thank you for joining us. Then we have joining us from Berlin, Mikko Kotari, Director of MERIX, who has daily business, of course, China. Then we have joining us from Tokyo, Kazuto Suzuki, Director of the Institute for Geoeconomics. Thank you so much for being with us on your national holiday, a sports day I just learned, so that's brain sports for you this afternoon. And then we have two very important in Europe business representatives who will share their reflections from business perspective with us. That's Luisa Santos, Deputy Director General of Business Europe. Needs no further introduction, has been, of course, there for many years and representing a strong voice for businesses throughout the years. And then we have in the Netherlands, Fokko Wijzelaar, who is now the General Director of the Business Federation in the Netherlands and the Confederation of Businesses in the Netherlands. And of course, used to be Director General for Business and Innovation. So he has seen the topic from both ends, both as a policymaker and now as representing businesses. So the topic today is how to move forward with de-risking. This is, of course, central to the EU's economic security strategy that was published last June. And there is now, I think, a need to identify practical steps on how do we move forward. And for this, of course, the G7 has been discussing the topic in Hiroshima last summer also. But there's a need to identify, I think, still approaches and instruments, and businesses and policy officials are looking for what is exactly the shared approaches and the risks and that need to be addressed, as well as the responsibilities and the division of responsibilities between them. Because one thing is clear, to put de-risking into practice, we really need more cooperative approaches. And there have been attempts in Europe and in Japan, in particular. Japan is a front runner, of course, on economic security, and I think an inspiring example to many in Europe also these days. There have been initiatives to try and foster such cooperation between businesses and government. So let's have a look this morning at what has been done and take stock of what might work also in Europe and what might not. So hopefully, thereby our debate this morning will inspire governments across Europe also into action. And that is, of course, joint action with the companies that we need so much. So first, Mikael, over to you. You've done, of course, interesting research, and you published last November already a report on international geoeconomic risk management, I think it was called. So you have quite some experience with talking to businesses, and we're curious to hear about what you learned from that, and of course also how is the de-risking debate in Finland?
Sure. Thanks, Maaike. Thanks so much for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to engage in this discussion this morning. I'd like to start with a sort of making a broad and slightly theoretical point relating to economic security and de-risking in general. That I think we ought to be aware of. I'll then follow up with a few practical observations. So on the theoretical point, I think most analysts of international relations and security are quite familiar with balance of power theory, and the notion of a security dilemma. It's sort of the closest we come to an iron law in international relations. And traditional security dilemmas are activated by geopolitical balancing, right? So states strengthen their military preparedness in response to others doing the same. And that often catalyzes an arms race, making everybody worse off. That's the tragedy, that's the dilemma of traditional geopolitics. And that's all familiar stuff. Now, much less thought, I think, and less talked about, is that there's a similar dilemma at play in geoeconomics and economic statecraft. So applying export controls, sanctions, industrial policy, reshoring policies to strengthen economic security may easily come to feed a sort of a geoeconomic chain reaction, a tit for tat of deeper and more protectionist measures. And that's a spiral, in fact, that let's us not forget played a large part in actually the outbreak of the Second World War. So we should be aware of that sort of dilemma, that there's an economic security, a potential economic security dilemma involved with de-risking as well, that we need to be aware of and take seriously, and that we need to manage very carefully. Because what de-risking really is about, I think, is what I would call balancing dependence. So balancing dependence is sort of the equivalent of balancing power, but in the economic sphere. And balancing dependence can easily generate an economic security dilemma, this sort of tit for tat, as states seek to adjust their level of dependency relations to similar efforts by others. And in the process, the sort of the interdependent fabric of global economic relations may start to come apart, and which may have far-reaching reverberations for the international system. Now, the challenge with balancing dependence and therefore de-risking is that in comparison with balancing military power and traditional security threats, it's much more complicated to balance economic dependencies for several reasons. First, the very complex interdependence of today's global economy makes it very difficult to calculate the costs of it, and to whom precisely the costs will fall in the end, and who will suffer what sort of. So if we are to de-risk, we really ought to have the right intelligence about our own dependencies. And so far, I think we have too little intelligence of the kind. So what we need to start investing in is that intelligence about our own dependencies and where the costs will fall for what sort of measures. Secondly, I think unlike traditional military balancing, this sort of de-risking, what I call sort of balancing dependence, requires heavy involvement of the private sector. So it's the private sector that operates our critical supply lines. It's the private sector that owns our strategic economic assets, our infrastructure services, and it will need to be committed to building redundancies and sharing information on supply lines, supply chain vulnerabilities with the government. So what is needed is an effective strategic level public-private dialogue, without which there cannot be any effective de-risking or economic security. We need to set that dialogue up. That's the second point, right? The very practical one. First, we need intelligence. Second, we need to set that sort of public-private dialogue up. And finally, in geopolitics, sort of traditional geopolitics and the military sphere, allies usually have relatively common interests and do not directly compete with each other. They usually find it relatively easy to unite against a common adversary. This is different in the economic sphere. So in the economic sphere, allies and partners will simultaneously compete internally as well. So even if Europe and the US agrees on the need to economically contain Russia, de-risk from China, they're simultaneously also involved in an internal competition that will reflect on the precise measures that they prefer and take, and that may be actually a potential source of friction in their internal relationships. So there's the danger of triggering a geoeconomic chain reaction and this sort of economic security dilemma, not only in relation to some external actors such as China perhaps, but also between the transatlantic partners, the EU and the US. So for the future of transatlantic relations, and by extension for relations with like-minded partners such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, managing this economic security dilemma should be of utmost concern. And that calls for strong coordination around de-risking and economic security policies writ large amongst these partners. And that sort of coordination will require to be institutionalized somehow, so that it won't be at the mercy of electoral cycles, right? So we need a new forum to harmonize economic security measures and to assist with information sharing and as geoeconomic sort of risk assessments and all that. And that sort of forum, I'm not sure if we have that forum at the time being. We have the G7, we have the TTC with the US, between Europe and US and so on and forth, but they don't seem to function for this purpose right now. So we might need to actually create a new forum for this sort of institutionalized coordination around these policies. So that's sort of my initial thoughts and scene setting the sort of into this subject, so and leading the way. So I very much looking forward to engage in this discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Very interesting point, of course, comparing the security dilemma of earlier times with today's situation. And the state was never a unitary actor there. And it's even less the actors that are, of course, in the economic security dilemma involved are even less of a unitary actor. So perhaps if following up on your final point, if the G7 and TTC is not functioning in a way that, or it doesn't deliver on a need that we have today, is that because the private sector is not part of it, or what do you see as a main reason for that?
Well, I think I think first of all, the G7 was set up for a different world, completely different world actually. That was so it's not. It doesn't have the sort of the secretariat there either that would provide a sort of risk assessment of the sharing of situational picture, the involvement of the private sector, right? It doesn't have those means in there right now. So we probably need a forum and to set up something where you can actually institutionalize a public-private dialogue, really involving the private sector there, where you commission risk assessments that include these sort of new geoeconomic risks that are presently not included in our national risk assessments. We need to get them in there, these sort of new risks. And we need, of course, to set up a legal framework for the exchange of this sort of economic information exchange. That legal framework might not be there, and there are, of course, antitrust issues, for instance, involved with that as well, for private companies to actually be able to engage in that sort of information exchanges. So these are the sort of issues that we really need to start thinking hard about, and how to institutionalize this sort of thing. Okay,
thanks a lot. So moving from Finland, I think a country that for decades has invested more than many other member states in supply chain management and economic security thinking because of one risk that's actually at your border. Moving to that other country that is now also so prominently, not always explicitly mentioned, but always on the mind of everybody when we talk about de-risking, that's of course China. So Mikko, economic security cannot be just about dealing with China. But it's a big part of it, right? So please share with us your insights on how to deal with this, both dealing with China per se and perhaps, getting the private sector on board. You have some experience with that as well, right?
Thank you so much, Maike, and great to be on this panel with fantastic colleagues. Good morning, everyone. Let me make 3 points, and I think they align quite well with what Michael just set us off with. The first is simply to contextualize a little bit the German debate where we are, because I find it important to recognize that despite the fact that we are able to have this conversation here in this online format, and we have an economic security strategy in the European Union and the G7 talks about it, we are far away from a consensus on the scope of where we need to go, on the methodologies that underpin our assessments and responsibilities for different types of factors. So I think contextualizing the German debate might be helpful. Then I want to make a point about the huge opportunity that we have here, which is really about policy learning. And it's not just for researchers looking at this, but I think for policymakers, it's a rare, I think, situation that we can really look at other jurisdictions and not really copy and paste, but be inspired by solutions that they found. And certainly that goes also for corporates. And final point will be about priorities, a bit similar to what Michael did. On the German debate, just 2-3 examples maybe to showcase where we are. A major German company that has deep exposure to China speaks of their China risk as the biggest one being the German government. So I think that's important to recognize. There's a homeland dimension to what companies see here. They consider government action as part of their risk portfolio, whether we like it or not. And on balance, for some companies in Germany still, their China risk is one that is largely about government action back home. Second point is a senior German official being asked, very senior indeed, how does the German government organize economic security, or how does it intend to go about it? And the response is, we don't do that and we can't do it. And maybe there was a misunderstanding in the communication, but again, this was just a few months ago. And I think this is where we are today. This is the 4th largest economy, and senior government officials really have no clue how to operate in this new environment. And then the final point is about the German-China strategy, where obviously this issue of managing dependencies was front and center. But the current response and concrete action that has resulted from the strategy, apart from internal coordination, is the German government will have conversations with corporates about their China risks. So our current mechanism, based on a 1-year-long strategy process in managing economic security, is let's have some conversations. And I think that's not meant critically, but it's just a realistic assessment of the state of affairs where we currently stand in terms of actually assessing China risks. Now, that's maybe a bit negative, but I think it's worth to take that into account. So a huge opportunity for policy learning, and I think learning among all partners. That's my second point. And that goes both for how do we actually do risk assessments, and second, I think, for how to organize economic security governance more broadly. And I think it's fantastic to see how much the Japanese example has been raised as something to learn from. The same goes, by the way, for Dutch experiences or Finnish experiences for that matter. So I think in this case, really, Germany will be in a position to not, again, copy and paste, but learn from other like-minded partners, including the ones that are represented here today. So risk assessments, many countries have done trade analysis exercises. We know of Sweden, of Finland, of the Netherlands, of France. Germany hasn't done such an exercise, for instance, in a government-led fashion. The Bundesbank recently came up with a study on that. So these are first steps. But I think it's important to look at the different methodologies that have been applied and simply agree, okay, this gives us an assessment of whatever problems might arise in this part of our exposure. But all of that requires, I think, greater alignment, a very baseline research type of exchange, what actually works best and what analysis is bringing us forward. I also think there's still a lot of conceptual work that needs to be done. It sounds very theoretical again, but we speak about risks, uncertainty, vulnerabilities, sensitivity to risks, about dependencies, different from strategic dependencies. And honestly, I don't think that we are having a very sophisticated debate about that in Europe at this point. Looking at definitions about indicators, how to look at these issues, I think is still work that needs to be done. Final point on this learning opportunity, I really think that there's a need for a liberal de-risking approach. So countries really come to this with very different political economy backgrounds and traditions. And I don't think the German solution will be very much alike to what maybe a French solution will be at the end of the day. So maybe the Netherlands, Finland, elements of Japan, all of that is really a pool where better policy learning is possible. So let's work towards that liberal approach to de-risking. I think that's important. Final point, what can be done? I think my priorities are quite similar to what Michael just outlined. And I'll try to be one step more specific if I can, but it's not easy. So transparency and reliable information is first. You've called it, I think, economic intelligence. I think that's critical. The current question that we have here is what's the right division of labor between the European Union and member states? So what's the work that the Commission is doing? What's the work that member states have to contribute to that? And honestly, I think no one knows. No one knows how the European Commission wants to go about that. Expert groups being asked or not being asked, what's the timeline? I don't think that's the right state of affairs. And I also think member states have their own responsibilities vis-a-vis their stakeholders to do that assessment on their own, independent of the European Commission. So some member states have done that, but I think a key issue here obviously is the role of company information. Our experience, Michael, you asked about it, and I think Kasuto will tell us more about it. It's extremely hard to get to reliable corporate information on these issues, and there's good reasons for that. It's not that corporate secrecy is easily to be breached. You mentioned, Michael, I think, issues of competition. Tackling that problem through surveys, I think, is a good starting point, but we probably also need, and that's my second point here, when you speak about trusted business policy platforms, what we also need is action groups that look at sectoral specific issues, because China risks or exposure risks to certain non-EU or non-OECD countries, they can be very generic and aggregate, but what's really required is a deep dive into specific technology ecosystems. And on that front, I think it goes much beyond boundaries of national member states, and the Commission would be well suited, and member states, to shape these coalitions of affected countries, companies, ecosystems in a way that they can generate the right information. Final point, and I think other colleagues will agree on that, we talk a lot about defense, risk, etc. Corporates really also need signals and concrete action on playing offense, so providing alternatives to the risks that have been identified. So the promote dimension of the economic security strategy. Otherwise, this whole discourse risks at being overly risk-centered. So talking about possible alternatives, opportunities, I think is absolutely critical. Otherwise, we will not get the corporate sector on board. Thank you, and back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Miko. Excellent. And I think this perhaps lack of attention or the relative attention to that opportunity side in the draft of the economic security strategy also made for some changes that we saw at the very last minute, right? Where there seemed to be, on paper, there's already a more balanced approach, but is that also really what's happening in action already? So thanks for mentioning that. Kazuto, Professor Suzuki, your, of course, experience has been mentioned already several times, and I mean experience of Japan and analysis of that. You've done a survey among at least 100 Japanese companies. That was, I think, a great challenge to put together. But please share with us some insights on that, and perhaps on how that has fostered conversation with the Japanese government also. As you are, as I understand correctly, the government at least is preparing an update of its economic security strategy, right?
Right. Thank you very much, Mike. I think this is an excellent panel already, and I think both Mikael and Miko has made a very fantastically interesting point. I'll just provide some of the observation that I have made and some of the analysis that of Japanese experience. Well, first of all, I think there is the culture matters. I think there is a lot of cultural, the corporate culture or cultural relationship which is embedded in the history and the culture between the government and the company. For example, in 1980s when Japan had a difficult trade friction with the United States, the Japanese government and the Japanese companies are working together to face the sort of an economic coercion from the United States, which was not exactly an economic coercion, but it was a more of a political pressure. But I think there are certain experience that we can do things together. And I think that this sort of a prior experience has made it possible to establish some sort of a dialogue between the government and the businesses. The second historical experience is that 2010, when Japan had a territorial dispute with China, China stopped exporting the rare earth mineral, which is extremely important by that time for Japan to build the hybrid cars, the magnets for the hybrid cars. And that had a significant impact on the Japanese industry, particularly the automobile industry, which has made a significant impact on the understanding among the business leaders that there are risks involved in dealing with China. If you depend heavily on China, then that would be that would make ourselves very vulnerable. So it is some sort of a 1973 when we had oil shock, and then we had the rare earth mineral shock, and these experiences had given the lessons to the corporate management to understand that this is, there are certain risks. So the survey that our institute has conveyed with 100 companies in Japan, this survey, which is translated in English, so please do search, had a very long list of what are the risks to deal with China, and the Japanese companies are now being very risk aware of. I think the awareness of the risk is very high. The point is that the government, in the relationship or that strategic dialogue between Japanese government and the businesses, the government has certain responsibility to set up and identify what are the strategically important elements, what are the strategically important items. So the Economic Security Promotion Act, which was established in May 2022, has given the power for the government to identify the items, but the government closely negotiate and discuss with the businesses how much it would affect their business, their business activities. So the Japanese government finally identified 11 items or 11 categories of the items which are designated as the strategically important items, including the batteries, semiconductor, the chemicals, medical goods, etc., medicines. And also the Japanese government identified 14 different sectors as the critical infrastructure, so that the government will be able to monitor and screen of any procurement activities for the critical infrastructure operational companies to procure from, which company and which country. And the government would say no to certain procurement plans. Also, the Japanese government has set up the 20 different categories as the promotion side of the science and technology field, including quantum computing, space, maritime technologies, etc. And these 20 fields are the target of what the Japanese company is encouraging for the industry to invest in Japan. So these are the areas where the Japanese government is taking certain list of the technologies that is required for the Japanese dual-use technology, dual-use purpose technologies, and the government will prioritize these technologies as the primary target for the subsidies and R&D fundings. So these are also the promotion side of the economic security policy, because in our economic security strategy, there are two different strand of the policy purposes. One is to establish a strategic autonomy, and one is to establish a strategic indispensability. So being indispensable in the supply chain network and supply chain ecosystem is an important gaining the important power for the Japanese government and the industry to work together to use that as the sort of a protection for Japan from the economic coercion from others. Because if we become as an indispensable country, then it would be the idea is that it would be harder for the other countries to exercise the coercive measures. So all in all, I think the Japanese experience has given us, based on these historical and the cultural context. So it may not be easy to copy and paste, but I think it is important. I think if we extract some elements that can be applicable for European cases, is that it is extremely important for the companies to be aware of the risks. And without this, it is extremely difficult to motivate the companies to get involved in the discussion with the government and to improve the security, economic security for the country. Because at the end of the day, what government aims at and what companies aiming at are quite different. And it is important that if there is no government policies or strategies for the economic security, that would eventually have an impact on the economic policies, the economic activities on the businesses. Meanwhile, the government takes the company's profit seriously, so that the government will limit the items and the issues to be controlled at the minimum level. So this is basically the Japanese version of the small yard, high fence, and the Japanese government is maintaining this idea of the small yards to make sure that these items will not expand uncontrollably, and make sure that if there is an expansion of the list of items, then it needs to be discussed with the businesses. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuto. And I think the minimal approach resonates well with the liberal economic security approach that Miko was talking about, where it's also about limiting, but putting in context the risk awareness of companies. Many follow-up questions I could ask, but I would like to first give the floor to our business representatives, because I think it's so interesting to hear their perspectives. Is that minimal perhaps in Europe achieved? Are we on the right track when the European Commission last week published its own list of critical technologies and some next steps that are, well, just now presented for identifying critical infrastructure more broadly in the way, compared to what we've done, or identifying also promotion elements? Is that what companies are looking for? We will hear from one of you from Brussels, and then of course from The Hague. Louisa, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Mike, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to participate, and a lot of good ideas have already come up. I will try to focus a bit initially on what is the situation in Europe, then on the challenges for companies, and then the way forward. Now, what is the situation in Europe? I think the Mikko and Mikael already alluded to it. We have a challenge in Europe because national security is, of course, the remit of the member states. And this means there is always a very thin balance between what can be done at EU level and what is a competence of the member states. I mean, we see it clearly with export controls, but this applies also to screening of foreign direct investments or potentially an outbound investment screening mechanism. So this is the first point. The second point is, of course, we are now talking about the economic security strategy of the EU, but the EU has been taking measures already before, even before this strategy. Let's not forget that we have an anti-coercion instrument, and we are the only ones who have it. We have not implied it yet, but it's a specific tool, a legislative tool that is supposed to protect or in an ultimate lead to sanctions if European companies or European countries are subject to coercion. And let's not forget that this came actually following actions from Donald Trump. So it's not a reaction to China, it's even before China. Of course, then it came again after China's action on Lithuania, but this is something that came already before. So the EU, before doing a strategy and a communication, had already some specific actions. So coming back to the communication, I think the communication tries to address all the three aspects that were already mentioned. The protective side, of course, the promotion side, but also the partnering. Now, what for us is important is that this is done in a balanced way. We should not put too much emphasis only on the protect part. We need to look at the promotion side, and the promotion side is, of course, possible financial support to some sectors in Europe, taking into account that we do have state aid rules that need to be considered, because we don't want this to lead to a fragmentation of the internal market and an unfair competition also among EU member states, and this is a risk. But we also need to look for the promote in terms of diversification. We need to try to find new markets. If we want, or we need to be less exposed to China, what are the alternatives? And this means we need trade agreements, for instance. We need to facilitate our trade and investment in other markets that are, in principle, less risky. And then the partner approach that for us is extremely important. We should not be looking at this as an exercise from G7 against the rest of the world. We are seeing already that the narrative is sometimes very difficult when, for instance, the EU and the Western is defending, of course, and very lightly so, the support to Ukraine, but a lot of countries sometimes are not understanding this approach. So we need to avoid using this as a tool to even create further barriers with the rest of the world. So partner with willing countries. And this is very important when we are talking, for instance, about critical raw materials. This is extremely important. If we want to depend less, for instance, from China, we need, of course, to find other alternatives. And then for us, when it comes to the implementation of all this strategy, we need, again, to be targeted and do a proper assessment of what are the risks and what are the tools to mitigate those risks. We know the Commission is now starting a process of precisely making a risk assessment, because until now we've been very much looking at dependencies on the basis of trade flows, but this is a very limited assessment. We need to go deeper, because we also need to look at sometimes dependencies are not only direct trade or investment flows. We have a lot of supply chain integration with China, for instance, in a number of sectors. So how are you going to assess this kind of risk? For this, of course, you need a business. So what are the challenges for business? I think the main challenge is that first, we are incorporating already a number of costs as European business. We are still heavily impacted from the fact that we had, of course, due to the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia, had to decouple completely on the energy side, almost completely. This has led to an substantial increase in energy costs. Companies are still coping with this. We are still much in a more disadvantaged position as compared with our colleagues in Japan or the US. We are incorporating the costs of the digital and especially the green transformation. And now we have been asked to absorb the costs of economic security, of potential de-risking. So it is difficult to explain to companies how you're going to do this simultaneously or almost simultaneously, while at the same time remain competitive and continue to invest in Europe, continue to create jobs in Europe, continue to innovate in Europe. So it is a bit difficult, and this is one of the questions we have and we need to explain to companies. So this is very important. The second aspect is that we are talking that our main actors, our main economic actors are SMEs. So of course, SMEs are now more aware of what is economic security, because they have been suffering also of trying to implement the Russian sanctions. So before, sanctions were only for big companies. Now also SMEs have been confronted with the question of economic security in the way. So it's easier to try to convince them that this is the trend they need to understand, but we still have a lot of problems of raising awareness. So part of what we are doing right now is precisely to raise awareness in companies of what is the current situation and what they need to do. And what they need to do is not very clear, because we don't have a clear idea what are the risks, and also a clear and defined idea what areas are the most risky. So I think in the way forward, it is very important, of course, that we do a good private-public cooperation, both in identifying the risks and also trying to make sure that we have the right responses. We don't want this to lead to more protectionism. We want this to lead to certainty, because of course, right now we have a list of critical technologies with 4 that will be more critical in the sense of the protect. But coming, for instance, to biotechnology, this is an area, for instance, that is very much related to food security. So we need to be very careful on how far are we going with the aspect of security. And final point is, of course, the question of business sensitive information. I think everyone has touched upon this. It's very difficult to convince companies to provide this kind of information. And we're also thinking, we've been discussing also with you, with Miko, and also with Michael, how can we try to set up a mechanism to try to obtain this information from companies and try in this way also to support companies. Thanks.
Thanks, Louisa. That's extremely helpful view from Brussels, where beyond perhaps the critical raw materials sort of dependencies assessment and then investments that are expected in that to also facilitate trade with certain countries where we do have dependencies. That's sort of one element of the promote action. I'm very tempted to ask you whether sort of the new business advisory group that you joined for Global Gateway, is that also, in your view, part of the partnering on economic security with that other group of countries? or is that a whole different agenda?
For the moment, I think that's more an agenda driven by projects, projects of supporting to infrastructure in particular. So less the economic security part, but of course, one aspect we are insisting a lot is that this support comes with certain conditions, with certain principles, transparency, the respect of sustainability, objectives also in terms of financing, that we have clear guidance on how this is going to be financed. So this is the aspect that comes a bit and is a bit connected to economic security, but less in the aspect of the risk that we are more focusing in this discussion.
Yeah. It's perhaps helping those countries with their economic security by reducing their dependencies on just one actor. Thanks for that follow-up. Focko, over to you. What's the state of play in the Netherlands?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for asking me being part of this excellent panel. I learn a lot. I would start by saying that in these times we need the private public sector dialogue more than ever, perhaps, and that's not only true in geopolitics, it's also true for the discussion on planetary boundaries and digitalization, and they come together and they also interplay with each other. And I think that point has already been made, but it's important to have in the backs of our minds, because I will come to that later on. But if we do not take that into play, we might risk drawing the wrong conclusions from only looking at geopolitics. What has been said, and I totally agree with it, is we need information from individual companies to understand their dilemmas and decisions. If we don't understand how it's being discussed in boardrooms, we might be led astray by taking a too much macro approach to what's happening, including that companies do have a different approach to certain risks, and they do have different opportunities. A company, to a certain extent, for example, can choose its jurisdiction, whereas obviously a government cannot. And so what might be in the best interest of the Netherlands might be different from what's in the best interest of an individual company, and a company might decide differently. And that you have to take into account also in constructing the dialogue and also in giving the answers. On issues as key enabling technologies, raw materials, value chain, security, direct foreign investment, etc., this all is true. So now what we see in the Netherlands is that the Dutch government has taken a huge interest and has explored ways of constructing this dialogue, both nationally as well as internationally. We see that a lot of knowledge institutions like yourselves at Clingendael, but also others like the NWO and TNO, and also private companies like Reed Elsevier, trying to explore the theme. But what we think is that we do need more structural data. So we have this project-based data and individual investigations, but I think we need to have more structural data, international comparable data, and we also need to have timelines. And we can only construct that by starting. And I do think in that respect, what has been done in Japan and the survey being set up in Japan is certainly an example and something to follow up also in the Netherlands or more broadly in Europe. Obviously, there is a dialogue inside the business community in the Netherlands. We have at VNO-NCW expert groups working on it and discussing with each other. We have a yearly research and development barometer in where we also ask questions on geopolitical themes. But that is not replacing a more structured approach like in Japan. So I would very, very much encourage ourselves, so to speak, to set up such a survey, and perhaps best at the European level, because as has been said as well, national security in Europe is a national issue. What's in the name? It's national security. But at the end of the day, I think we as a business community do view the single market as the right level to discuss these type of issues. It's because of the impact of the internal market. 450 million consumers is much more impressive also to the outside world than only 17 million Dutch people, to take just the Dutch example. And it's also that we do think that in terms of secure value chains, we approach single market allies as being as good as Dutch production. So in that respect, I think the business community should also be quite vocal on that these type of issues should be addressed by the EU Commission first and foremost, and that member states should adapt their policies. And I think that will be for sure something being said also from VNO-NCW's side to the upcoming European elections and also to the new European Commission to take this very seriously. And we have seen it in the past with the toolbox on 5G that is actually in favor of member states to have such a toolbox which they can use, both in terms of mechanics to be used as well as in terms of the European shield that protects the individual countries. On the opportunity side, it has been addressed as well. I think looking for new combinations and new or reinforced allies is quite important. Obviously, political risk is big, is back big time. Also in the thinking of companies in the more free trade period, sometimes it was viewed as not so important anymore, but that is certainly back in the boardroom. But we should also then take into account in the debate with the public sector that we do need to see also a follow-up in policies, taking into account also the need for protecting profits at company level and the need for maintaining a competitive edge in manufacturing. And when we combine things like the planetary boundaries, digitalization, and the geopolitical risk, sometimes, as Louisa also said, it seems that all costs have to be borne by individual companies. And if they should do so, then obviously their profitability might be at stake. And I take one example of the energy-intensive industry. If you look at that industry from a geopolitical level or from a planetary boundary level, a lot has to be done. But given the relative energy prices at the moment, perhaps the answer cannot be to outsource it to outside Europe, which you should do from a cost point of view, perhaps as an individual company. But then obviously in policy making, the public sector should take into account that to maintain attractiveness for this sector, you should do something in your policies. And this is also true for new sectors to be developed, also being pointed at by Louisa. If you take the example of biotech or the example of AI, we do risk in Europe that these type of industries are being developed and are being scaled up outside Europe. And that's because of the regulatory burdens in Europe. And that's not to say that you don't have to address the negative sides of AI or biotech. But in construing your regulations and your legislation, you should be very much aware that if we do want to have a vibrant industry sector and these new sectors, you do need to take certain risks also into your policy framework. And if you don't do so, your risk is that the economic strength of Europe is going to be undermined. And in that sense, at the end of the day, it's also true that economic strength is the basis of your economic security or your security at large as a continent. That is what I wanted to add to the discussion. a bit more practical perhaps than early interventions, but that's what you can expect from the business sector. Thank you.
Of course, that's what we were hoping to get from you, Foucault. Thank you so much. And it's interesting to hear both you and Louisa also call for the proper regulatory environment. Louisa, of course, internationally through trade agreements, and then you also the EU internal market regulation, how this is important to also, and economic competitiveness of companies needs to be taken perhaps more into account when thinking this through. And then, of course, the point that both of you mentioned of knowledge awareness that needs to be raised. Kazuto, you've listened to 4 Europeans speaking from different perspectives. Can I first invite you to reflect? And of course, to the audience, I've seen various suggestions for further reading, which we greatly appreciate and take note of. But at the same time, of course, do feel free to use Q&A for questions. We are reading this Q&A box, so we can follow up and put your questions to the panelists once they are in there. But first, perhaps your reflection from Japan on where does Europe stand in your view? You started by mentioning the culture of risk awareness that Japan apparently has been building for decades. And then Europe sort of waking up to this challenge relatively more recently, not as recent as last June, of course, but relatively more recently. What do you think?
Well, I think there is a lot of interesting things going on with in the economic security field, but I think some of you, many of you mentioned that there is a problem of the 2-level games of the EU at the economic, where the, most efficiently making an economic policy, whereas the security lies in the hands of the member states. And I think this distinction needs to be overcome. And I think EU needs to have, well, at least in terms of the economic security field, and I think the European Union is, what European Commission is trying to do, is to set up the whole dimension and the strategies for identifying what are the security, what are the stakes in the security field through the economic means. And I think it is, it seems that there are still less importance or less sort of a clear-cut vision of what to do with with China. I think China is both opportunity and the risks, and I think from a Japanese point of view, what you need to do is to leave companies to make decisions while they have the proper understanding of the risks. So I think what is happening for many years in Europe is that there are very much profit-driven understanding among the companies that is taking a very short-term visions and taking the sort of the low-hanging fruits in investing in China. And I think this needs to be, controlled from the political side. And I think this is where the policy strategic dialogue needs to focus on. I think this is one of the lessons that Europe may have learned from the dependence on Russia. And I think, both the government and the industry were not so fully aware of the issues of risks, and I think there are a number of the sort of the statement of regrets about dependence on Russia from European side, and I think this is something that needs to be redefined about the to see the long-term benefit by taking a certain measures to limit the risks. And I think risk analysis, of course, has been mentioned by many of you. And I think it is in Japan we are doing. I mean, both Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and the and the Cabinet Office, which is now preparing to establish a think tank which is dedicated for the risk analysis and analysis of the ecosystem for understanding the where the risk lies, and also in terms of the corporate secrecy. Japan, the Economic Security Promotion Act will establish the public-private council, which is to discuss about the security risks of the certain critical technologies, and this will be based on the security clearance mechanism, so that it is basically protected by the law, that if any discussion inside this council needs to be protected by law as the classified information. So that's the kind of thing that we are doing as a food for thought.
Wow,
Over
that's
to
a
you.
very concrete way of trying to address that key concern of companies, of course, of data that they share being out there and available to perhaps too many others. Let me link that to a question that we did get in the chat about the time frame. The question is to all of you, I think, in Europe. What time frame do you emphasize for Europe to get to action and structure public-private dialogue on economic security? And perhaps we know from Foucault and Louise, I think, that the small and medium-sized enterprises should also be part of this. And perhaps some reflections on sectors also, because, well, making choices there will be important to keep things manageable also. Perhaps, Mikael, we can start with you first.
Sure, thanks. On the time frame, I think we have no time to lose. We need to get going immediately, right? So what we need to do is we need to get this risk map. First of all, we need a survey and a proper risk map that so as to raise the awareness among companies, because as we've heard here before as well, and that's my feeling as well in Europe, is that there is still not enough awareness of these risks in Europe. So we need that risk maps to raise awareness. Secondly, we need a sort of sector-specific roadmaps for economic security due diligence, if we want to call it that. And those sectors are really, I think, already to some extent identified in the economic security strategy. So the sector sort of comes out from there to a large extent. And thirdly, if it's so that risk awareness is not high enough, or that we don't have enough of sort of risk perception we perhaps need also to discuss incentives for companies to get the sort of to invest in the redundancies and in shoring up sort of secure supply and in this issue. So we probably need to discuss the incentives as well, what the government can do. Should there be tax breaks, for instance, for investments in corporate resilience? Are there other incentives to stabilize supply chains under strain, and so on and forth? We might need also to engage financial analysts and insurance companies that do have a lot of insight into risks such as these. So far, I think we've been discussing risk awareness very much, but there might be a need for discussing incentives and what the governments, member states, and the European Commission can do. That's sort of my first take on that question. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Mikael. Mikko, over to you.
Look, I agree on the sense of urgency that Mikael put into this. At the same time, we're facing governments and corporates alike are facing a set of, I think, issues that they have to deal with at the moment. So indeed, prioritization will be key. And that requires a first analytical step, which is to look at those sectors, and they will be different for each member state, that have a certain level of overexposure that can create strategic dependencies. I don't think it makes sense to take this very broad generic approach first, and that can be easily done. We know that, and then you break it down to a set of, I don't know, top 10 to 15 companies first, and engage with them in the relevant conversations. And that can be done, and I think ministries would be well served to take such an approach early if they haven't done this. I mean, we know in the case of the Netherlands, for instance, that there was a certain company that was particularly affected by geopolitical developments in the semiconductor space, and obviously they have had for a long time in-depth conversations with the Dutch government now. Similar exercises, I think, will be required for the German automotive industry, and for the chemical industry in Germany, and others who have particularly high exposure and dependency. One point that I'm just using my slot here, not to respond to your question, but I find it particularly important for all of us to be frank, transparent, and sometimes maybe also accept differences in perspectives on what actual de-risking means. So do we accept that companies are still investing more in China than they might have been in the past? For some companies, this means that's a rational response to geopolitical developments, and it's localizing more in China. It's localizing their supply chains more in China. For a company that, for instance, has 15% of their revenue exposed to China, but where the global market share of China for their products is 30%, is basically a catch-up in investment, still part of a rational response that we would accept. I think this is the type of questions that we also need as analysts to be very clear about. From my perspective, I would think this is possible and should be tolerated, and requires also a defense from analysts such as us to be clear towards a wider set of stakeholders, including in government and wider society, that responses to risks might require actually more China than less. It sounds maybe paradox for those of us who are very exposed to a geopolitical minded set of conversation, but this is something that we need to be, I think, open and transparent about.
So being more open to the in China, for China approach, is that what you're
yeah, but more generally, I mean, is 15% or 20% of revenue exposure to China okay or not? I mean, this is, and under which conditions? And that's just a starting point. I think we need to be open to these very divergent points of comparison that we have for different sectors and companies.
Important point indeed. Louisa, what would be your answer to that?
Well, I think urgency, yes, but urgency should not mean rushing to conclusions. And we are seeing already, I mean, just to give an example, when we are considering an instrument on outbound investment, I mean, the US has been discussing this for about 5 to 6 years. And well, they presented a proposal that is still not final. Now we are already saying that this is something we need, without even doing before an assessment of whether this is a tool to address some of the risks. So before, we need to be clear what are the risks, we need to be clear what tools do we have or don't have, and whether we need to fine-tune these tools or even look for other tools. And I think here, the business sector needs to be involved, because otherwise, I mean, we are running to this approach that we feel is also a consequence of COVID, but of course of the geopolitical environment, that you have governments more and more interfering and more micromanaging companies. And this is something that will go down very badly, of course, because companies can always accept it, but they can also take the decision to move away, to invest somewhere else. And this is, of course, a risk for Europe, and this is something we don't want to. So we need to make sure that this is a process where the business sector is well involved, and that the business sector perceives this as a need. At the moment, a lot of companies do not see the need for Europe to be a bit more assertive in this area. And final point, I'll come back to reinforce 2 points also that Foucault mentioned. First, that it's important we would support a more European approach, because of course it's important for the single market. We are very integrated. We don't want unfair competition between us. So it's very important, but governments also need to be convinced about this. So it's not just a pedagogy that we need to do on companies. We also need to do on the national governments, because they don't see the point. They don't see the interest of giving more competence to the European Commission. So this is another area we need to work. And the final point is competition with the rest of the world. We are not just among ourselves, G7, we are also among others. And of course, this means that when companies think about de-risking, they also think about what will happen if I become less competitive with this strategy. Is it still for me feasible to continue to invest in Europe, or should I move elsewhere? So all these are aspects that I think we need to take into account before taking further decisions on concrete action.
Thanks, Louisa. That's getting us to Foucault, and perhaps you want to address also in this point of competition that's of course ongoing between European companies, but also between European and American companies. There's a question that just arrived on that front. Yeah. Whether measures can be taken in Europe to prevent American companies from benefiting all too much from de-risking from China by European side. Would you be able to incorporate that in your answer? That'd be great.
I would try to do so. And first, let me say, like the others, that we need to take this up as an urgent issue, and I think it should also be one of the key issues for the new European Commission and for the new legislature. And in that respect, I also think that Nico made an excellent point on that we should be wary of what is rational for companies and take that into account when policies are being made. And that also addresses a bit, I think, the question being asked on American companies taking over market share. There is a debate sometimes in Europe that is very principled in certain aspects. But we should also go down the consequential route and discuss the consequential route of our principle-based discussions. And I think if we do strike the balance between a principle-based discussion and a more consequential discussion, then like Nico, you might be accepting that companies do have a China for China strategy, and that in that respect they can also maintain market share in China, be it on a different footing than before. And also when we look at the current legislation in Europe, in the CSRD or the CSDDD, then these type of legislation do offer opportunities for economic security. They stress, for example, more circular ways of producing, which in itself imply that you're less dependent on raw materials, which is a great opportunity, I think, also in terms of, again, economic security. At the same time, they do imply also risks from a geopolitical point of view. And I take the example of trade agreements that might become more difficult if we do have a too principled approach towards trade agreements, as we saw with Mercosur quite recently. And if we do not come to trade agreements with South America or Latin America, or if we do not come to a working Africa strategy, to take another example, because of our principled approaches, that might also imply that we lose out on the economic security side. So I think that there in Europe, the balance has to be struck between a more consequential approach. What does it mean if we and what kind of steps do we find acceptable, even if they do not mean that we get to the final answer as you would like it from a principle-based approach.
Thanks, Foko. That's a very important point, of course, to be made as well. I'm very tempted again to continue the conversation, but we're getting to the end of to 10:15 in the morning in Europe now, so that's the end of the discussion today. I'm sorry to those who also popped in questions that we could not address. I think it shows that we are well, we should be continuing this discussion. There's a real need to be to have this discussion between academics and government officials and business representatives. Perhaps just a final closing round and just a one sentence from everybody. If there was one thing on your wish list that you think should be addressed, could start to be addressed from tomorrow, in this field, of course, to act on de-risking, whether that's the European Commission or the Finnish or the German or the Dutch government, or the Japanese government, what would that be? Your one last wish or first priority for the governments to address. And I would like to take that in reverse order. So Foko, if you would go ahead and be first.
Yeah, then I will take up a rather small point, but quite important. We should get our knowledge base in order and start to survey companies and corporates. Corporates like SMEs and inform government on the real issues that are at stake in boardrooms.
Enhancing our knowledge base. Thank you. Louisa.
Well, I think the first one would be that the Commission starts really consulting business on a more structured basis, including in the risk assessment that they are doing right now.
Consulting business. Thank you. Kazuto.
Right. Well, what I would ask for the Japanese government to do is to make sure that we have a complete mapping of the ecosystem of the supply chain, which is very, very difficult to penetrate. But I think this, the Secrecy Act and protection of the corporate secrecy may allow to have a much better and accurate and map to be assertive about, whether the government policies are right or wrong.
And that, of course, also relies on information that would be retrieved also in the conversation from companies. Thanks. Mapping of the ecosystem. Mikko, what would be yours?
Well, great points so far. Allow me two. One is indeed I would support the issue of getting a survey done that maps China risks across Europe. I think that's an urgent task that we need to get done. Second is more German lens here. These conversations that have been announced in the China strategy, they need to happen. Otherwise, it's just an announcement, and would love to see the results of that also feeding into wider processes. So that's Berlin homework that needs to be done.
Thank you. On to Helsinki. Mikael.
Well, I very much echo the previous speakers here. I'd certainly like to see the commissioning of the survey to map the risks. Second step would then be the roadmaps to how to deal with those risks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Well, that's a clear call from all sides, I think, and hopefully a conversation that we can continue in the future. Again, we have to close it for now, but thank you so much for all your contributions, and hopefully until the next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.